Noted. Good evening, everyone. I think we're about to get started. If everyone could please find your seats, we'll be getting started in just a moment here. Thank you. Welcome. This is the annual plenary lecture for Foundations of Political Theory. We're very pleased to have with us this evening Professor Roberto Unger. Many of you will be familiar with his major contributions to the field of law, social theory, economics, and politics. In addition to his position as the Roscoe Pound Professor of Law at Harvard University, he served as a founder of a major political party, as well as the Minister of Strategic Affairs in the Brazilian government. He's written over a dozen books, only a few of the most recent including The Self-Awakened, Free Trade Reimagined, and The Left Alternative. His ongoing projects as a scholar and a politician, I think, both express and vindicate his tremendous faith in the power of political imagination. And his ambitions are no less than to communicate that power to citizens at large, promoting the extension of democratic experimentalism to economic institutions and to social affairs. He'll be speaking to us today on the topic, the vocation of political theory now. Please join me in welcoming him.
Use it just for recording and turn it off?
I don't know. I'll ask.
Yeah. We're just concerned with solving the microphone issue. What's the deal?
It says they can't control it, so you can't separate it from the recording.
Okay, so maybe I should speak loud but distant from it.
Good idea. I feel probably too close.
So first, can you hear me? No? Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. Not too close to the microphone because of the echo. My theme is the task of political theory now. My thesis is that political theory can matter to thought and to society only by making trouble in a particular set of ways. If it fails to make trouble, it becomes ornamental and inconsequential. It could, for example, be practiced as a disinterested history of political ideas, or as the application of the abstractions of political philosophy to the conundrums of policy, or as a philosophical penumbra of the conventional political science. But all these practices, if not animated by a conception, and in particular by a conception of the decisive institutional and ideological structure of society, condemn political theory to impotence. Political theory can matter by making trouble. By making trouble with regard to 4 sets of problems. I shall call them in this reflection the American problem, the programmatic problem, the methodological problem, and the metaphysical problem. They are connected. They are connected by their common engagement with the institutional and ideological regime of society. That regime is the true object, the overriding subject of both political thought and political action. What I propose in this intervention is not a theory, or even the outline of a theory, but only an agenda. An agenda compatible with many theories, but also an agenda that excludes many theoretical orientations. It is in no sense neutral. It is a partisan engagement about the future of political thought. Underlying this conception of the agenda that excludes is a rejection of one of the central tenets of liberal political philosophy. The idea that the order of society, and in particular the system of right, can and should be neutral among conflicting visions of the good. No regime can be neutral. Every regime of right tilts the development of human experience in some directions and against others. The professed aim of neutrality will always be found to stand in the service of the entrenchment of some sectarian, limited version of human experience against criticism and change. Nevertheless, the illusory goal of neutrality is related to a realistic and indispensable objective. The truth that is hidden in that lie. The objective is the construction of an order that is inclusive, that is open to contradiction and to innovation, and that above all has the attribute of corrigibility. The American problem a central flaw in the political culture of the United States is its antipathy to fundamental institutional reconstruction. One might represent this flaw, exaggerating, in the following way. Americans believe that at the time of the foundation of the Republic, the United States discovered the definitive formula of a free society, which forever after needs only to be adjusted from time to time under the pressure of crisis. The rest of humanity must either subscribe to this formula or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. What is striking in this attribute of American political consciousness is the exemption that Americans have accorded to their institutions against the reach of the experimentalist impulse that is otherwise so vital in American life and American thought. Now, many American thinkers, from Jefferson to Dewey, have been in rebellion against this flaw and have tried to convince their fellow citizens to lift the exemption and to trade some bad American exceptionalism for some good American experimentalism. On the whole, however, they have failed. The fetishism of the institutions is manifest most clearly in two areas. The first area is the cult of the Constitution. So, for example, Americans think that the liberal principle of fragmenting power is naturally and necessarily associated with the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, represented in Madison's scheme of checks and balances. That is what they think, but they are mistaken. There is no natural and necessary relation between the liberal and the conservative principles. They are associated not by necessity, but by design. In a constitutional scheme that immunizes the social order to some extent against transformation through politics, and that makes constitutional change depend upon prior national crisis, intentionally. The second major area in which this exemption against criticism and change is manifest is in the institutional form of the market economy, and especially the regime of property. A market economy has no natural and necessary form. It can be organized in any number of ways with radically different consequences for the arrangements of production and exchange, as well as for the distribution of advantage and opportunity. But all experimentalist thinking about the institutional content of the market economy tends to be suppressed, generally in the world, but especially in the United States. Now, this feature of American political culture becomes significant in relation to the recent historical experience of the United States. In the closing decades of the 20th century, the United States underwent a series of downward inflections, of increasing inequality, of political disengagement, of disassociation among people. And no political project has been advanced or even proposed in the United States that is capable of reversing these inflections. The progressives, the American progressives, have no program. On the whole, their program is the program of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. The fulcral point, or one of the fulcral points that demonstrates the consequences of the absence of such a program and the relation of this absence to the antipathy to institutional reconstruction is the question of the organization of the new economy. A new form of production is emerging in all the major economies of the world, including the American economy. A form of production characterized not only by accumulation of capital, technology, and knowledge, but also and above all by the transformation of productive activity into a practice of permanent innovation. The vast majority of people are excluded from these advanced sectors of productive experimentalism. The twin practices designed to attenuate inequality and exclusion in the past are powerless to redress the consequences of this new form of hierarchical segmentation of the economy. Compensatory and retrospective redistribution through tax and transfer, or the defense of the interests of small business against the interests of big business. What would be necessary would be a new repertory of forms of partnership between the state and small and medium-sized firms, and a new set of arrangements allowing these small and medium-sized firms to compete against one another and cooperate at the same time in regimes of cooperative competition, to the end of propagating throughout the economy the advanced productive practices. Then in the future, new regimes of private and social property might emerge and coexist experimentally in the same market economy. In such a situation, wage labor might later cease to be the dominant form of free labor and give way to the combination of cooperation and self-employment, as almost all the liberals and socialists of the 19th century proposed. And no human being would continue to be condemned to do the routinized work that can be undertaken by a machine. None of this can happen, this reconstruction of the market economy, without a simultaneous advance in the reinvention of democracy. The freeing of politics from the influence of money would be only the beginning. A new set of arrangements to heighten the temperature of politics, that is, the level of organized political mobilization, to hasten the tempo of politics through the rapid breaking of constitutional impasse, which Madison, on the contrary, wanted to perpetuate. Through the deepening of the experimentalist potential of federalism to create countermodels of the future. Through the development of practices in the state that would allow the government to come to the rescue of groups condemned to forms of disadvantage from which they are unable to escape by the devices of collective action available to them. And through the combination of the features of representative and of direct democracy. All of this may seem immensely distant from the present horizon of American politics, and yet all of this is very close to the American spirit. The programmatic problem. Ideological controversy in the world has been dominated for 2 centuries by a simple hydraulic model. The market or the state. More state, less market, more market, less state, or some synthesis of the two. This conception bears no significant relation to the real structural problems of contemporary societies. The new form of hierarchical segmentation of the economy, its division between advanced and backward sectors. The relation of finance to the real economy, so that finance, instead of being a bad master, is compelled to become a good servant. The inadequacy of compensatory redistribution on the one hand, or of cultural and ethnic homogeneity on the other hand, as a basis for social solidarity. When the only adequate practical basis of social solidarity is direct responsibility to take care of other people beyond the boundaries of one's own family. And the insufficiency of forms of democratic life that continue to make change depend upon crisis. The surface of ideological controversy in the world continues to pit shallow freedom against shallow equality. According to this dominant conception, the conservatives would be those who prefer freedom, and the leftists those who prefer equality, within the horizon of the established institutional arrangements. Now, the concerns of the liberal and leftist thinkers of the 19th century gives us a clue to the falsehood, to the failure of this view of what the ideological controversy is or should be about. For them, for all of them, the overriding objective was not equality. It was a larger life for the ordinary man and woman. And the instrument was the institutional reconstruction of society. Their conception of bigness framed too narrowly on a view of aristocratic self-possession, and their proposals of institutional change far too dependent on institutional dogmatism. But now the task of political theory, is to reshape and reinterpret the ideological controversy. There is now on offer in the world a very restricted repertory of alternative institutional arrangements for the organization of different areas of social life. And this repertory has become the fate of contemporary societies. What is theory? What is political theory if it is not an anti-fate? One of its highest tasks should be to enlarge this repertory, and to enlarge it, it is necessary to reinvent it. To develop the ideas that can inform the convergent projects of democratizing the market economy, deepening democracy, and organizing civil society outside the state, or creating the conditions for its self-organization. None of this can happen unless political thought and political action respond to the imperative of the structural imagination. Not blueprints, but a direction and the first steps. The methodological problem. How to think about society. Today, across the whole field of social and historical study, we witness the predominance of rationalizing, humanizing, and escapist tendencies. In the hard, positive social sciences, economics first among them, what prevails is rationalization. Its philosophical spirit is the spirit of a right-wing Hegelianism, explaining the established arrangements in a form that vindicates their naturalness, necessity, or authority. In the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal theory, humanization, a pseudo-philosophical prop to the idealizing practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy, and idealization of the law as a system of policies and principles. In fact, our interests and ideals are always nailed to the cross of the institutions and practices that represent them in fact. And the law is the site of this crucifixion. In the humanities, consciousness embarks on a roller coaster of subjectivist adventurism, disconnected from the reimagination and remaking of society. The proponents of these three tendencies, the rationalizing, the humanizing, and the escapists, claim to be adversaries, but they are in fact allies in the disarmament of the transformative imagination and the transformative will. One might think that in the rest of the world, outside the rich North Atlantic countries, there would be rebellion, intellectual rebellion against these tendencies. But instead of rebellion, what there is on the whole is mental colonialism. This predicament has its origin in the history of social thought. The revolutionary idea in the history of European social theory is the idea that society is made and imagined, that its structures are a kind of frozen politics, arising through the temporary and relative containment and interruption of practical and visionary strife. this idea was circumscribed and even eviscerated in the history of social theory by the compromises that it made to a series of deterministic assumptions, clearly manifest in the most influential critical theory, Marxism. That there is a closed list of alternative forms of social organization, that each member of this list is an indivisible system, and that a logic of laws of historical transformation pushes forward the succession of these supposedly indivisible systems. All these ideas are false, and all undermine the force of the original revolutionary insight. What then did conservative social science do in the subsequent historical period? It rejected these necessitarian illusions only by also repudiating the initial revolutionary insight into the constructed and contingent character of the structures of social life. Our task then, and the task of political theory, is to rescue that insight, the rational kernel, from the mystical shell. And political theory, rather than being the supine philosophical penumbra of the established orthodoxy of political science, can only be its enemy. The fourth problem is the metaphysical problem, the perspective of judgment on these structures. The basis on which we think and judge normatively. Now, there are two main discourses that dominate the high culture with regard to the nature of the normative. I shall call them the Kantian and the historicist. Now, by the Kantian, I don't mean simply the position espoused in Kant's philosophy. I mean something much more general. The idea that we can develop a practice of normative judgment on the basis of an abstract conception of human freedom, and then derive from this conception the normative conclusions that we seek, a self-grounding from this conception of freedom. And this Kantian view is both empty and individualist. It has only the content that we put into it in the first place. And consequently, it is unsurprising to find that it is incapable of resisting the structure. I give the example of the political philosophy of Rawls, a central figure in contemporary American philosophy. In retrospect, the abstractions of that philosophy of justice will be found to be a transparent philosophical gloss on the homely practices of compensatory redistribution in institutionally conservative social democracy. The other normative position is the historicist one. All we can do is to choose the context, the tradition, the society, the culture. There's nothing outside, no foundation. It is the reality itself. And as I exemplified the first view with Rawls, I could exemplify the second with Rorty. It misrepresents our relation to the context that we inhabit. They make us, but we exceed them. There is always more in us than there is in them. They are finite with regard to us, but we are infinite with regard to them. We can not only defy them and change them, but we can seek to transform their character so that they're not just there beyond the reach of challenge, but come to respect and to nourish our structure-revising freedom. These two positions, the Kantian and the historicist, once again seem to be opposed. And yet they regularly converge. They complement each other. They live in peaceful coexistence, and often even in some jumble, some pastiche, as if they were two sides of the same view. Unresisting to the structure, profoundly unpolitical, because they deny the made-up, porous, and contradictory character of these decisive structures, and wedded, both of them, to what Spinoza condemned as a doctrine of two regimes, of a kingdom within a kingdom. They are all anti-naturalist. But greater than these flaws is the basic fault that they share of disregarding and denying our powers of transcendence. There is in politics a prophetic element, a vision of unrealized human possibility. These prophecies are not conjectures about something that we could call human nature, and yet they have empirical elements, because they rely on assumptions about the limits to our self-transformation, as well as on assumptions about what in the long run matters most to us. We must then reject the weak secular pieties represented by Kantianism and historicism in favor of another conception of the normative, a conception that does justice to who we are and can become, as beings who always immeasurably exceed the structures that they inhabit. Now, these four agendas that I have here defended, an American agenda, a programmatic agenda, a methodological agenda, and a metaphysical agenda, converge. Their common element is a disposition to engage with the decisive reality of the established institutional and ideological structure of social life, and to do so in a fashion informed by conceptions of our humanity, not just our past humanity, but our future and possible humanity. Now, in conclusion, I want briefly to address two obstacles to the pursuit of the program that I have outlined and advocated. The first obstacle is personal, existential. The second is historical and collective. The United States adopted at the end of the 19th century the model of the German university system, of the specialized disciplines and the professorial chairs related to these disciplines. And this institutional regime of the universities strengthened a tendency that existed already anyway. A young academic, early in his trajectory, comes to master a certain analytic and argumentative apparatus, and then commonly spends the rest of his life feeding material into this apparatus. Now, this is a form of belittlement, and a form of belittlement that denies or betrays the primacy of vision over method. Methods are a dime a dozen, and methods are made to be burned up progressively in the pursuit of agendas and of conceptions. One might object and say that to enact such a view, such an alternative view of the shape of a life in thought, one would have to be a genius, and to have and to execute a project and systematic theory. But it is not true. The agenda that I proposed only exceptionally in its limiting form appears as systematic theory. It can much more often and more effectively appear as a set of particular explanatory and critical practices. What the pursuit of this agenda requires is not genius in the vocabulary of the Romantic illusion, but courage. Courage informed by a conception. Courage is not the highest virtue. It is lower than the virtues of purification, attentiveness, enthusiasm, renunciation, and much lower than the virtues by which we become more human by becoming more godlike. Our openness to the others and to the new. But courage is the enabling virtue, and without it, all other virtues are rendered sterile. And for this reason, it is the first attribute of both the thinker and the agent. The second obstacle is historical and collective. We live in a counter-revolutionary period. I hope a counter-revolutionary interlude after a long revolutionary time in the history of humanity. And in this counter-revolutionary interlude, especially in the rich North Atlantic countries, all transformation of structure, even if piecemeal and gradual, as on the whole it must be, can begin to appear as a fantasy. One of the highest objectives of the practitioners and the thinkers of democracy must be to establish democracy as the form of political life that enables us to master the structure, to destroy the power of the dead over the living, and to weaken the dependence of change upon crisis. but by a dangerous circularity, it seems, that the institutions and the ideas capable of weakening the dependence of change on crisis themselves depend for their inauguration on crisis. The imagination must then intervene to right the scales. The task of the imagination is to do the work of crisis without crisis. The best hope of political theory is to take the side of the imagination in every department of social life. The imagination, which shares in the attributes of life itself: surfeit, spontaneity, and surprise. Imagination, imagination to the rescue.
Thank you. I've been asked to offer a comment on the remarkable lecture that we just heard. And I'll offer a very brief one because I just heard it too. And also because I think a talk like yours deserves time for audience engagement. So we don't have a lot of time. I'll just say a few things. Roberto Unger has offered a terrific map of our condition. Perhaps as importantly, he has offered a terrific call to recover critical and politically engaged theory, to use courage, to draw on courage, to make courage a foremost virtue in that work, and to make imagination a foremost intellectual bearing, ethos. He's also offered a quite brave call for a return to structural analysis and an extraordinary account of the interlocking bankruptcies of American political life, capitalist or neoliberal ideology, and the academic disciplines or academic prisons of thought in which most of us operate today. It seems to me in the comprehensiveness of the vision that he offered, we're recalled to something like the power of Marcuse's ability to link in our historical conjuncture thought, politics, material life, rationality, and academic life. At least that's one of the things that Marcuse managed to do in One-Dimensional Man. It also recalls the power of Max Weber to link the state of politics, knowledge, the academy, capitalism, and rationalization. In this regard, even as Roberto Unger has offered us a powerful call, an inspiring and urgent demand that we return to our senses, that we return to the reasons that many of us entered political theory, that we return to a care and a concern for the state of existence that political theory might illuminate. In thinking about Roberto Unger alongside Marcuse and Weber, there is also, of course, in that comprehensive vision, something of a very dark account, something of an account that suggests that the interlocking character of thought, of rationality, of the economy, of political life, and of the specific American experience is pretty close to a trap, but it's a trap he urges us to spring. I want to simply offer two additional problems to the list of problems that Roberto Unger gave us and suggest that they might be problems for the vision or the urging that he has offered. One I would call the democratic problem or the problem of the demos. When Roberto Unger insists that we must deepen democracy, that we must find a way back to radical and direct democracy, it seems to me that he counts on the demos to want something more than what he calls shallow freedom, shallow equality, passivity, instrumentalization by the machine, and so forth. Our question today, of course, is what if that is not what the demos wants? Not just what if the demos is so damaged by the condition that Unger has given us that it can't find its way to those things, but what if those things don't really lie at its, as it were, essential core? What if the human being doesn't really want freedom or equality? What then? What if we deepen or democracy, or find our way to recover strands of direct democracy and find that the demos doesn't produce or call for or demand its own deep freedom and deep equality? What if it calls for something else? That leads to the second problem I want to raise, which is what I would call the theory power problem. What if political theory, the political theory that Roberto Unger urges us to do, and I absolutely share in the urgency and the urging, but what if, we must ask ourselves, the theory that we are calling upon ourselves to do is speaking to a demos that rejects it? Do we, theorists, with our structural or post-structural or structural or post-structural analyses, if we speak to a demos that rejects the account that we offer, do we want our account to have power anyway? And if so, what Platonic or Leninist road might we be going down again? I'll stop there. I'll invite you to respond if you like, or we'll simply, okay, let's open it up. Questions, remarks, responses. And I'm not going to call by name, I'm simply going to call by waved hand. So, your waving hand, yes?
Yeah, I respond so deeply to what both of you have said. It seems to me that political theory is now in an age of what I would call profound scholasticism across the board. That's the word I use for all of what we're talking about. But as I listen to the statement of all the problems and the added problems, I think my thoughts, we have to understand the reasons behind this scholasticism, the constant narrowing of boundaries within which we think and talk. And it seems to me that if you look at all the things that you raised, in a sense, jointly, what it constitutes is a fundamental crisis in civilization. The end of the liberal age, the end of the Republican age, the end of the early modern age of this long revolutionary cycle. And the result is that people know all the things I think you're talking about. This is not the 1950s. They're terrified. They're terrified by going down, by opening up the door, they're going to fall through a rabbit hole. So the question really to me is very simple in a way for political theory, and that is, how do we address the fact that people know these things, but it's their absolute inability to look at them, because in 5 minutes you can get students to agree with you about the things you're talking about.
Great, thank you. Terrific. Do you want to respond or do you want to collect a few? Okay.
For people to make comments.
Okay, well, at some point we're going to ask you to at least give us a final comment. All right, more comments. Yes?
How do you tell the difference?
A little louder so everyone can hear you.
How do you tell the difference between imaginative political theory and escapist political theory? Because is it sometimes, what looks like escapism now could be imaginative a little bit later?
Others? Yes. Very loud so they can hear you in the back.
Sure. I'm wondering if the problem of methodology is partly that it sort of contradicts our innate humanity in the sense that we were born actually to play as well as to follow method. And that when you're afraid to fail, you can't invent. And I find in some of my own work, the criticism that it's had is that, because I'm trying to put things together that put together before, it doesn't fit certain methodological bounds. And I thought that was a very interesting part of the speech actually is, do we need to reclaim the spirit of willingness to fail as part of courage? That we should try something out, and if it's terrible, just start again.
Here in the red shirt. Yeah.
You pointed out one problem, well, it's actually worse. A lot of the demos doesn't really want fundamentally.
Yeah. Do you mind standing? It's a terrible room. I mean, it's a grand room, but it's a terrible room.
This is the demos problem. A lot of people really don't want this sort of freedom and equality. And they point out the problem of both the content approach and the historicist being so trapped in the status quo and so on. But when you use the imagination, one part might be values, but the other is, how does this work? And aren't we ultimately kind of trapped by our experience and our history in comprehending what we can do with imagination? And if you just say, go with it, why are we not just sort of madmen playing with people's lives? How is the value problem, but then sort of factual one? How can you be free from the structure and yet act in a way that's not destructive?
Yes.
Well, first of all, that was inspirational. That was an uplifting of our minds or spirits, whatever we want to use, to get out there and use our imagination to think outside the box. So first, thank you for that. And in the spirit of the first Q&A comment, I think of the challenge of bringing that level of inspiration that you say that you're hoping we will do to the working class, because the one glancing reference to the working class was a reference to not having people do the work that machines could do. That almost sounds like fighting words to many of the working class. But I see hope in something you said, which was about the possibility for, how did you put it, new structures to emerge? Things like the possibilities that are emerging from green capitalism, the things that are emerging from new initiatives. And I'm thinking of something that goes to the core in some of your other work, the turn toward pragmatism. Because of the possibilities that concreteness, how a particular class is going to respond to these ideals, and the possibilities of concreteness that come from the tangibility of that reference you made. And so, imagination is the rescue, but concreteness, I'm thinking in your own thought, your own pragmatic hope to revive, to rekindle in the kind of pragmatism.
Great.
It's a question and a comment.
One last. Okay, two last. First you, and then you.
It seems to me that a fundamental requirement to free the imagination is de-reification of all these institutions and of even the concept of human nature that we have. Because both ordinary people and social theorists operate within limits set by their assumptions about the necessity of institutions that we have.
And yes.
Thank you for your talk. I'm very friendly to some of your comments about the need to reconstruct political theory along the lines of courage and imagination. The one question about courage and imagination is, what is the line to draw about its exercise with respect to what political theory recommends in terms of the institutions that sort of coalesce into sort of ideological interlocking and oppression of the demos. So at what point or what norm might constrain an imagination that's would call from a political theoretical perspective for something like a destruction or violent response to the structures of oppression?
So if I may invite you to say anything you like in conclusion.
Well, many points. I'll make three comments, and my criterion of selection is the hope that these are themes that could relate to subsequent work, to subsequent collective work. And the problem with an event like this is it has no context, it has no sequel. Someone parachutes in, there's this discussion, and then everyone goes back to business. And there's no easy solution to that problem. So my first comment is this: what lends interest and vitality to political thought is the combination, the dialectic between an engagement with the real structure of society, its institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions, an engagement to explain what exists, and to understand what exists, one has to have insight into the adjacent possible. And second, conception of the development of humanity, of the unfulfilled potential of mankind. Not, as I said, as a conjecture, like a conjecture about the atomic structure of a physical object, but like a prophecy. Now, what happens with this conventional political science and the depoliticized society in this counter-revolutionary period is that it's neither of these two things. It lives in a shadowy world of the normalization or the naturalization of the existing arrangements and the established ways of thinking. So what's the problem then? The problem is to transform this alternative agenda that I described, this dialectic between visions of humanity and engagement with the structure, into a normal collective practice, into something that you can go out and do tomorrow in particular work, and can then become a rival to the established political science. Then there's a contest, and the contest is life. Now, my second comment regards a democracy. All the democracies that exist in the world are relative democracies, partial democracies. And the most evident sign of the inadequacy of these forms of democratic life is their inability to master the structure. So what is the structure? The structure is inherited, the dead ruling over the living. It's produced by all of these shaping forces. We didn't really choose it. And now the lawyers come and say, like Thomas More, he who silences can be understood to consent. Democracy has to be developed as a collective practice for mastery of the structure and for creation of the new. And political theory, the kind of political theory that I advocated, is the ally of democracy. And that's a large agenda, which goes in every direction into all of the institutional details that you quite properly demanded. Now, my third comment concerns the question of the supposed recalcitrance of humanity to all of these transformative hopes. When politics is serious, and when political thought is serious, they share to some extent in the character of religion. There is no serious politics that is not at the same time religious. So politics is not just about the division of the pie, it's about who we are. Now, in this same period in which we live, and we see this sullen, resentful withdrawal into private life, this disillusionment with collective action, this use of things and of the accumulation of things to replace dependence on people. In this same period, what we find in the world is the worldwide propagation of a message. And the message is not carried simply by the world religions. The message is carried by the creed of democracy and, above all, by the global popular romantic culture. The message is that every human being is godlike. That's the message of the soap operas and of the popular culture. The message is not a message of the attenuation of inequality simply. It is not a saccharine message of the humanization of the inevitable. The message is the message of greatness, of the greatness of the ordinary. This is the revolutionary message. And humanity now is, as always, divided. It wants to believe but cannot believe. It's divided between the escapist fantasies of religion and of the popular romantic culture and the humdrum day-to-day experience of incessant belittlement. This is the real circumstance, and it's in this circumstance that we have to intervene. That's the reality. And so this is not some Panglossian idea of inevitable rise. This is the enunciation of a battle, which is simultaneously political and religious. And the proposal to engage in the battle in the hope that greater vitality, greater power, greater scope, greater intensity, once tasted, will be found to be irresistible.
Please join me in thanking Roberto.